Here's a provocative question. Name the biggest stories of the century for Southeast Texas. What would make your list? Well, we have our list, and we're going to count them down. And it turns out to be a journey through the century. Before we start, let me explain how we came up with a list of stories of the century. We started with a couple of questions. What has had a long-lasting impact on the people of Southeast Texas? How unique is the story to the area? We sought opinions from historians and we did a lot of soul searching. It's not a perfect list, but a chance to look back as we move forward. It's hard to determine the impact of sports. Sports certainly brings people a lot of enjoyment, watching and playing them. And every now and then a sports figure comes along that transcends the game, that demands our attention. As much as they may try not to make any statement, they almost always do. We begin our countdown with number 10, the story of a Southeast Texan who changed the way we view women in sports.
On a summer day in 1932, a Southeast Texas native achieved what has to be the most amazing feat in the history of track and field. Mildred Babe Didrikson entered the National Amateur Track Meet for Women as the sole member of the Golden Cyclone team. That afternoon, she earned 6 gold medals, set 4 world records, and by herself won the team championship.
Babe Didrikson Harris was a tremendous competitor, and I think that she tried to excel in everything she did, and she did.
Mildred Didrikson was born in 1911, the daughter of Norwegian immigrants. Her parents moved from Port Arthur to Beaumont after the 1915 storm. She was a tomboy growing up, and by the time she was in high school, she excelled in a number of sports.
And what took her to Dallas was they offered her a job up there and to play basketball in the AAU. And so she moved to Dallas.
By now, she was known as the Babe, and basketball was her game. She would routinely score 30 points in a game at a time when a team might score only 20. In her second season with the team, she led them to a national championship and turned her sights on the 1932 Olympics. There she set records and won gold medals in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw. She had to settle for silver in the high jump after she was disqualified for her unorthodox style. She was voted Woman Athlete of the Year by the Associated Press, a title she would win 4 more times in her life.
Then to win the 2 gold medals and a silver medal in the 32 Olympics was absolutely, I think, the apex of her notoriety. From then on, she became a real recognized person for her achievements athletically.
Next, the Babe used her notoriety to earn a living at a time when there were no professional sports opportunities for women. She made public appearances, performed in various exhibitions including billiards, and barnstormed the country with a baseball team of men who sported beards and played on donkeys. She also discovered the sport that would carry her through the rest of her life, golf. She would dominate that sport like she did all the rest.
And she excelled, did well, won 17 straight tournaments and things of this nature. She used to have corns on her hand, you know, where she'd grip the club. She'd practice so much. She would, for the lack of another word, a fierce competitor.
In 1938, the Babe married professional wrestler George Zaharias. She went on to popularize women's golf and help establish the LPGA. The couple lived in Florida, but Beaumont was always home to the Babe. And when she battled cancer in the last few years of her life, she stayed close to home.
Well, she was in the hospital in Galveston. One of the last tournaments she played in was here in Beaumont. And she had a lot of friends here in Beaumont.
Babe Didrikson Zaharias' athletic accomplishments alone earned her the title of greatest woman athlete of the first half of the century. But her contribution was in how she lived her life. She refused to conform to a ladylike image, and she was the subject of rumor and innuendo concerning her sex and femininity. Through all this, she kept playing the game and winning. She changed forever the way we see women athletes.
The world-famous athlete is honored in Beaumont at the Babe Dickerson Zaharias Museum. It's located off of Interstate 10 near Gulf Street. It reads like a who's who of Jefferson County, the news story surrounding the James Committee investigation. By the time the story played out, elected officials would lose their jobs and Vice would be driven underground. That story makes our list of top stories of the century for Southeast Texas as number 9. And how we see those times is really a matter of perspective.
When the James Committee said it found flourishing in Jefferson County the oldest, largest, and best organized vice operation in the state, it was referring to places like this, the Dixie Hotel. The Dixie was the most upscale of the bordellos operating in downtown Beaumont. 5 gambling houses operated nearby. There were more bordellos and casinos operating out in the county and in Port Arthur.
It was a source of embarrassment, you know, and people just didn't really want to talk about it. And there was a lot of people who are still in Beaumont that suffered from this, whose family members were indicted or, you know, who got kind of swept up in it. And
this Austin attorney grew up in Beaumont without hearing much about the James Committee.
I met Mr. James when I was writing this paper.
She researched the story for a thesis paper that she hopes to turn into a book.
I think that he was quite politically ambitious, but I think he was one of these people that was just absolutely convinced of what was right and what was wrong.
In the first week of January 1961, Dallas State Representative Tom James held a 3-day hearing in Beaumont on vice operations in Jefferson County. The hearings were broadcast live on radio and television. More than 50 witnesses testified. The picture the hearings and the final report painted was of a community gripped by organized crime with the highest elected officials on the take. Sheriff Charlie Meyer admitted to taking $85,000 over 5 years. White envelopes with cash would appear on his desk and in his car. He didn't know where they came from. He called them campaign contributions.
You got the impression that Beaumont was just this wild, you know, lawless place. And I think really just the opposite was true. Not that it was probably a pretty safe place because the sheriff knew just about everything that was going on and he knew just about everybody's business, and the dangerous elements in Beaumont were kept neatly tucked into a little area.
In the end, the police chiefs of Beaumont and Port Arthur would lose their jobs. The state suspended Jefferson County District Attorney Ramey Griffin. He stood trial to remove him from office, with the jury hung after only 3 hours and 40 minutes of deliberations. He would resign before his second trial and continue to practice law here for years. Charlie Meyer would be indicted, fight removal from office, only to be beaten by Dick Culbertson in the next election. Meyer moved away. The indictment would be dropped from the books years later. There was no question that places like the Dixie operated in the open for years. But what still remains murky is whether organized crime was behind the vice operations. Tom James made it clear he thought citizens here lived in fear of organized crime.
I don't think the citizens of Beaumont were in so much of a moral outrage or were being morally oppressed as much as the business leaders were being prevented from expanding business into Beaumont. And that was more the, I think, tenor of the community and the fear. But as far as the local citizens, I just don't think they gave it much thought.
We're left with very little evidence of the days before the James Committee. The Boston Hotel, once part of the Crockett Street Red Light District, now houses law offices. The Dixie is scheduled for renovation. But ask Southeast Texans who were there, and they'll tell you stories, and maybe even whisper a few secrets.
By the way, the old Dixie Hotel is now part of the Crockett Street renovation project and could one day become a nightclub or a restaurant. And if you look for those gambling houses that were in downtown Beaumont, places like the Texas Club or the Liberal Club or Yokin Club, well, they're all gone. They've given way to parking lots. Well, there's probably no better symbol for 20th century America than the automobile, but it's only half the equation. At number 8, we look at how concrete and steel changed the way we travel and changed the fate of cities.
If you traveled by car in the first half of the century, You drove through towns and often down its city streets. A trip might take you right down Beaumont's Calder Avenue. Harlan Furry remembers that.
Well, it was generally a pretty slow process. You had to go on a lot of the city streets, and you had to do a lot of stopping and starting and turning.
He helped change that. By the end of the 50s, men like Harlan Furry were building a new national highway system, something called the Interstate.
I don't think anybody realized what was going to happen with the interstate, how much traffic was going to be on it and whatnot, you know. Even the highway department, I don't think, realized how much was going to generate.
And these new highways changed cities. You would always find development along highways. So when the federal government started talking about building new, wide, 4-lane roads to move military equipment, cities started lobbying for the road to come their way. Port Arthur made its pitch. Beaumont had already been first with a bridge across the Neches River. But when Port Arthur got its bridge, it would be something to see. 176 feet high to allow ships to pass underneath. It opened in 1938. It would become known as the Rainbow Bridge. But it was this bridge, in part, that kept the interstate from coming through Port Arthur. It would be too expensive to build another bridge that could accommodate the new superhighway. The road would come through Beaumont. Harlan Furry says he never really had a sense of just how important these roads would become.
We were just building roads, and that's what we were supposed to be doing, so that's what was going on. And we didn't really realize, I guess, what was taking place. And of course, then when it became the interstate, you know, then it was connected all over the United States then.
The plan originally called for the interstate to travel west across the city of Beaumont to connect with Highway 90 near the community of Amelia. But people complained about the interstate cutting through the city's newly developed West End. So instead, the new road took a sharp turn and crossed the city from north to south. Some 30 years later, the Highway Department would have to straighten out that curve. The Highway Department built I-10 across the city in sections as money became available.
The people had a lot of patience back there in those days, and we'd be working on a section of highway. We might have to stop everybody for 15, 20 minutes. Nobody got upset. They'd just stay there and talk to you and whatnot till we got the road cleared up to where they could go ahead and go.
The interstate changed the way we travel. People and goods now travel over the roadways instead of the railways. Today, we think nothing of driving to Houston or across the country.
Well, I'd hate for you to have to weave through Beaumont now.
It made our world a little smaller and a whole lot faster.
At one time, plans called for Highway 90 to go right down 11th Street in Beaumont. But those plans were ditched as engineers began designing the Highway 90 6996 exchange. The Highway 90 project evolved into Interstate 10 and, well, you get the idea. Those highway guys had to roll with it. Name any town and you can bet it was originally located where people could find fresh water. But these days, most of us don't think twice about the water that comes out of the tap. So making our list at number 7, the story of a project that guaranteed a future for Southeast Texans.
Will Kirkpatrick has been a fishing guide on Sam Rayburn Reservoir for almost 30 years.
You know, last year they had 6 bass over 13 pounds come out of here.
He now lives on the lake and knows how important it is to the Jasper economy.
You know, recreation is just a byproduct. It's just a little added incentive to having the reservoir. It's good for the economy, the local economies, but it's not what it was put here for.
But he also knows the real value of this lake has nothing to do with fishing. It's the lake that holds back the ocean. Southeast Texas waterways were dredged years ago to give ocean-going ships access to inland ports. That also allows tidal action to bring salt water up the rivers.
Some rice farmers started their crops in the spring of the year when the rivers were flowing well and couldn't finish them because salt water came up and stopped them from irrigating their crops.
The Lower Neches Valley Authority formed in the early 30s to supply fresh water to rice farmers. It now delivers fresh water to all cities in Jefferson County except for Beaumont, as well as to refineries and petrochemical plants. The LNVA recognized early on that what it needed was a large body of fresh water to maintain a constant stream that could hold back the salt water. In other words, Southeast Texas needed a lake.
We knew that in the 30s, that when we were created, that something had to be done to remedy this situation, or the Golden Triangle would not exist today if we had not.
The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began construction on what was then called the McGee Bend Dam in the mid-50s. It would take 10 years to construct a 3-mile-long earthen dam, spillway, and powerhouse. The lower end of the lake was cleared of timber, and cemeteries had to be moved. The lake began filling up in March of 1965. The cost of the project, $66 million. It was now named after a Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Texas Congressman Sam Rayburn. And the lake that Will Kirkpatrick now calls home is actually the second in a series of reservoir projects. B.A. Steinhagen was built first. The third is still on the drawing table. These huge public works projects seem like a thing of the past. But Tommy Hebert can see the day when we build lakes again.
And if the state of Texas water resources decline to the extent that they think that they will because of an increased demand by exploding population, they're predicting our population is going to double in the next 20 years, then something is going to have to be done to insert a little reason in these very, very elaborate permitting processes in order for us to keep ahead of the game.
Meanwhile, this guide will enjoy his 200 days a year of fishing on Sam Rayburn.
And it's pretty nice living here on Rayburn.
It's a pretty nice side benefit of having a guarantee of fresh water.
Another man-made Texas reservoir, Toledo Bend, opened 2 years after Sam Rayburn. It's the largest man-made body of water in the South, and no federal money was used to build it. 3 power companies paid for the dam and the power plant. Most of the year we enjoy mild weather, but as you know, the summers here can be unbearable. That hasn't changed, but how we cope with the heat has. And in our countdown of top stories of the century for Southeast Texas, we're at number 6. We'll look back at one invention that must have seemed like a miracle.
When Frances Letcher found this prize-winning art glass at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, she knew she wanted to build a church around it. It would take almost 20 years, and she never disclosed the cost. But she left as a legacy this beautiful church on Green Avenue in Orange.
There's no windows here that can be opened anywhere in this room, that's right.
There was one problem with building a domed sanctuary full of beautiful art glass. This is Southeast Texas. Imagine a Sunday service in August with no ventilation. So Frances Letcher hired the Carrier Company to design and install a system to deliver cooled air.
I think they would find it, I'm thinking of a miracle, really, in 1912.
That's right, an air conditioning system in 1912. And that makes the First Presbyterian Church in Orange the first public building with air conditioning west of the Mississippi.
But I would think in 1912 that people would consider it a real plus, and hopefully they'd want to join the church just to cool off if nothing else.
The vents are nearly hidden in the ceiling. Pillars are actually air ducts. The church generated its own electrical power in a nearby building to move air over blocks of ice and into the sanctuary.
I would imagine that the type of system they had, blowing air across blocks of ice, probably lowered the temperature in here, 5 or 10 degrees from outside. But it would also help get the humidity down.
But it would be a few more years before air conditioning would move into the home. The McFadden Ward home is a classic example of architecture before air conditioning.
So houses like this have more windows, easier access to porches, higher ceilings, fans, transoms, all kinds of mechanisms to increase opportunities for airflow.
People simply spent more time outside. Porches were common.
The porch was by far, if you wanted to think of it as a room, was by far the largest room of the house and was used that way for entertainments like card parties and things like that. So come summertime, this was an important room of the house.
This house even has an upstairs sleeping porch. Imagine the fascination when this house got its first air conditioner in the late 30s.
And there are diary entries that we have that talk about how fast the room was cooling and how much cooler it was in that room than the adjacent rooms and so forth. And so people were certainly very intrigued with the idea and very grateful for the increased comfort.
The real rise of the South has more to do with air conditioning than with Southern pride.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question that what they call the Sun Belt population growth had a lot to do with the growth of air conditioning. No question.
And on a hot summer day, who among us doesn't give a little silent thanks for air conditioning?
Both the McFadden Ward House in Beaumont and the First Presbyterian Church in Orange are available for tours. And you can feel free to do that any time of year. As you know, both historical places have air conditioning. The First Presbyterian Church has upgraded its air conditioning system at least twice in this century. The McFadden Ward home was not completely air conditioned until it became a museum. Well, if you had to pick what put Southeast Texas on the map, you'd probably say oil. But the fact is, you might want to rethink that choice. And making our list at number 5, we have the story of an industry that built Southeast Texas before the days of oil.
7 years into the 20th century, the largest industry in Southeast Texas would reach its peak. In 1907, the Texas timber industry produced 2.25 million board feet of lumber. It would never again produce that much building material.
Probably the biggest customer of lumber forest products at the turn of the century and into probably the 1930s would be the railroads.
The forest here seemed endless. Settlers found enormous longleaf pines and even larger 1,000-year-old cypress trees.
Those cypress trees were so big that in order to cut them down, they had to build scaffolding around the bases because the saws were not long enough to reach through the trees.
Men, both black and white, could find work. Beaumont experienced its most dramatic population increase in the decade before the 1901 oil boom. The Neches and Sabine rivers provided a way to deliver logs to Beaumont and Orange, sawmill towns, connected to Houston by rail.
It was almost a seasonal occupation in the early days. You couldn't float logs if the river's too low, and you couldn't really float them if it was too high either, because they would get out of control, float off into some bayou somewhere, get lost, or just would float downriver and bypass the mills.
The timber companies needed a new way to do business. Tyler County native John Henry Kirby enticed Eastern capitalists to build a railroad north out of Beaumont. He named his first stop after one of those capitalists, a man named Silsby, and extended the rail to a town he helped lay out, Kirbyville. Kirby then sold the railway to the Santa Fe Main Line. Part of the payment was a $10 million loan.
He bought 14 sawmills, mostly in Southeast Texas, including 3 in Beaumont. He paid off this $10 million loan in, what does the Santa Fe Railroad need most? Cross ties.
He formed the Kirby Lumber Company in 1901, and he would immediately close 2 sawmills in Beaumont and move northward. The company peaked between 1910 and 1920, operating 12 mills, 5 logging camps, and employing more than 16,000 people. That would change for Kirby and other lumber companies in the Great Depression.
Much of their assets was in land, and by the 1930s their land was, for their purposes, useless because it didn't have any trees on it. They had cut them all. In many cases, companies such as Southern Pine Lumber Company, which is now today Temple Inland, sold some of their lands to the federal government.
The federal government now owned tracts of barren and badly eroding land. Men were without work. So President Roosevelt established the Civilian Conservation Corps. Unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 25 were eligible. They served in military-style camps, earning $30 a month. $25 had to be sent home. They replanted the lands that would become the National Forest.
By 1938, certainly, there was already a proposal for a national park. So they could see the rapid removal taking place. And in light of the longevity of the bald cypress trees, it's not something you replace overnight.
Production shifted from building materials to paper products, and timber companies began to rethink how they used the forest.
So this was really the beginnings of commercial and really statewide forestry. You start to see the hiring of professional graduate foresters.
4 decades would pass before Congress established a national park in the woods that once seemed endless. Today, the Big Thicket National Preserve protects only a fraction of what once was the Big Thicket. And John Kirby's company would disappear forever in the 80s when Louisiana Pacific bought what was left of the company's assets.
The loggers would lose anywhere from 30 to 50% of the logs they sent down the rivers. And they couldn't send hardwoods down the river at all because they would sink. And the railway, of course, changed that. But today you won't find logs traveling by rail. You can't travel the highways like 96 or 69 without seeing a logging truck. Just about everybody around here has heard of the Spindletop oil discovery, but have you heard of the second Spindletop? Well, making our list at number 4 of stories of the century, the story of Spindletop you've probably never heard.
By the time self-taught geologist Mars McLean was trying to interest someone in drilling at Spindletop, the boom had long since passed. Pandemonium ripped through Beaumont in 1901 after drilling produced the country's first gusher. The hill just south of town filled with men who dreamed of getting rich. But by 1908, the hill had played out. The drillers and speculators moved on to other salt domes along the Gulf Coast. But Mars McLean believed more oil could be found on the flanks of the hill.
He had already found some discoveries around salt domes over in Louisiana and thought that around that salt dome Spindletop, particularly on the flanks, where the salt dome had come up and fractured all these rock layers underground, that oil might be in these flanks, in these cracks and fissures in the rocks.
The major oil companies passed on McLean's theory. It seemed McLean had talked to everyone except his neighbor, Miles Frank Yount.
He was a small operator in Sour Lake, but he lived in Beaumont, lived on Calder Avenue, and as a neighbor of Mars McLean, he saw him every day, but they never talked about oil.
The two men discovered they shared the theory of oil on the flanks. So Frank Yount quietly went about the business of once again drilling on Spindletop. On November 13, 1925, Frank Yount announced the news. He had struck oil.
In fact, I think the State Fair was going on at that time, the South Texas State Fair, and people heard about it. It was announced on the radio, and people were very excited, and again, people rushed out to the dome to see what was going on.
But this time was different. Frank Yount's oil company owned most of the land leases on Spindletop. The Yount Lee Oil Company would control its production, and gone were the gushers.
Back they were using steel derricks. They had Christmas tree valves and these whole assemblies for capturing the oil. They had tank farms. They knew how to control wells. So when they were drilling, you didn't have any gushers.
Spindletop produced another 50 million barrels of oil in the next 5 years. The Yount Lee Oil Company expanded into other Texas oil fields. The company employed 10,000 people. While other oil companies moved away, Frank Yount kept his offices in Beaumont in the San Jacinto building.
But he wasn't a flamboyant character. He wasn't out there just in the community a lot, being very visible. But he helped the community in a number of ways, very significant financial ways. In fact, one time the city of Beaumont, sometime in the early 1930s, could not meet payroll. And Frank Yount came through and paid the city payroll for that month.
Times were prosperous and Beaumont would see a building spree. The Edson Hotel, the LaSalle Hotel, the Goodhue Building, the Jefferson Theater, a new city hall, and a new county courthouse were all built during the era of the second Spindletop. Frank Yount personally built an apartment complex across from his home on Calder Avenue. He named the building after his daughter, Mildred. But when Frank Yount died at the age of 53, his company all but disappeared.
I mean, he was the heart and soul of the company. There wasn't anyone else to really take it over. So they didn't necessarily sell the Yount Lee Oil Company, they sold the assets of the company. So the company was disbanded.
So if someone asks you about the Spindletop oil discovery, remember Miles Frank Yount and ask them, which one?
You may not recognize Frank Yount's name, but there's another name associated with Yount you probably will recognize. Early in his career, Frank Yount befriended a man named Harry who had come to Beaumont to sell groceries out of a wagon. Yount trusted his friend Harry, and Harry became the secretary-treasurer of Yount's company. When Yount was raising money for his exploration of Southeast Texas oil fields, he asked Harry to buy stock in the company. But Harry was strapped for cash at the time because he had moved into the wholesale grocery business and he was expanding. When Yacht hit it big in the Spindletop oil field, he came to Harry and told him he owed him $750 for the piece of the company that Yacht had bought for Harry years ago. That $750 investment turned into millions. And Harry's last name? Well, it was Phelan. Harry Phelan. No event has affected the entire world like the Second World War. Here in Southeast Texas, shipyards in Orange and in Beaumont built ships for the war effort. German U-boats operated off the coast of the Bolivar Peninsula, and Beaumont's Terrell Park housed a prisoner of war camp. Thousands of Southeast Texans fought in the war and worked on the home front. And making our list of top stories of the century at number 3, we look at how the war shaped the character of a generation of Southeast Texans.
The day after 18-year-old Herb Stafford graduated from Port Arthur's Thomas Jefferson High School, he joined the Navy. It was June of 1944.
I knew they had 3 square meals a day, whereas the Army didn't.
Herb knew Mary from his school days, but she wouldn't become his wife until years later.
And then I can remember some of the fellows saying, "Oh, I hope it's not over before I can get out and do something about it."
They grew up with news and images of a world at war.
Well, I can well remember that one of the boys who was in our class was so eager. He was a gunner on a Marine airplane. And by the time we were at the latter half of our senior year, we got word that he had been killed, he'd been shot down. And that kind of brought it home to us. You know,
Herb Stafford served in the South Pacific aboard a ship that set up seaports for airplanes.
I mean, that's the way people thought in those days. They wanted to go, and we worried about not going. I had poor vision, and my father was a pharmacist, and he doctored me up on vitamin C before I went in.
And as soon as I became 18, I went to work at Texaco with the thought that I would work there till the war was over, and then I would go on to school. But the money got me. I was making more money than the local school teachers, so I stayed.
The war years were lean years. Most of the nation's output went to the military. People on the home front rationed essentials like sugar and gasoline.
I found in one of my scrapbooks the list of things that were rationed, and one of them, for example, was sugar. And you could get a ration book for every person in your household, including the youngest child. And you could use 1 stamp per week. And I believe the ration week ran from midnight Saturday to the next Saturday. And I heard people talk about when they ran out, they just didn't use sugar.
Herb would serve in the Navy until April of 1946.
Yeah, but we were just kids, you know, and it got tough at times, and other times it was a lot of fun. And
his ship was among the first Americans to arrive at Nagasaki. And the young sailor from Port Arthur saw firsthand the effects of an atomic blast.
Well, there wasn't much to see. It was total devastation, and we realized then that how horrible this thing could be. And we were...
Like most young men of his time, Herb Stafford was eager to serve and eager to go home when the war was over.
It made you realize that if you came out of this thing, that you wanted to, had certain goals.
For Herb, that meant going to college. Mary was part of a generation of women who were changing the workplace.
The jobs were for single people and for men, family people. And then when I went out to Texaco, I found out then that most of the women who were married were expected to quit. And then as the war ended, they did. And boy, I got promoted just right on up.
Mary and Herb got married and began a family. Mary quit her job at Texaco, and in the late 50s, they began Herb's Nursery. They retired a few years ago. But their war experience shaped their lives and the lives of their generation.
I think it helped us to grow up and to realize that there are more important things than just what I want.
A kid, 17, 18 years old, that leaves home and goes into the military in those days, he became a man overnight, and most of them turned out to be first-class citizens.
If you have relatives or friends who experienced the war years, ask them and you'll probably find they're full of stories. The generation that made the world safe for the rest of us is fading. It's estimated that the World War II veterans are dying at a rate of 1,000 a day. This country was founded on a contradiction that all men were created equal, while some men held others as slaves. That contradiction has led to racial problems as current as today's headlines. Well, making our list at number 2, the story to right that wrong. We look back at one moment in time here in Southeast Texas, a turning point, and the effort to tear down the walls of segregation.
People go to college for a better life. That's as true today at Lamar University as it was back in 1955, with one difference. Back in 1955, you could only enroll in classes if you were white.
And we were told in no uncertain words that blacks were not to be admitted. It was against the policy of the university to allow blacks to attend.
Theo Johns was a young civil rights attorney fighting the decades-old policy of segregation. Just about every part of public life, pools, drinking fountains, schools, were separated by race. Even public events like the South Texas State Fair had a night designated for blacks.
Black could not go to the parks even though they paid the tax, and they couldn't use the library, the public library.
In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling that profoundly changed this country. The court struck down segregation. The law of the country had changed, but not the hearts of all of its people.
I think that had been, if the students had been left alone, well, nothing would have occurred.
In the fall of 1956, 26 black students enrolled at Lamar University after winning a federal court ruling that summer. But white protesters, called picketers at the time, were expressing their disdain for integration.
No one paid them too much attention. Police, some of them, the state authorities, they were talking to the picketers and joking with the picketers. So the picketers got bolder.
The situation escalated.
They started stopping the blacks that entered the college and would not allow them to turn to come in. They also stopped all cars, searching of the white students' cars also to see if any blacks were there, and of course that met with the objections of the white students.
On the night of October 2nd, Theo Johns, pictured here, was in a car with one of the students.
The picketers tried to turn the automobile over. They threatened me with death.
Johns had enrolled in the business school as an act of solidarity with the students he represented.
I called to the state officers, that is the Texas Rangers, and to my surprise, they turned their back as if they didn't hear me.
The next night, more skirmishes. Lamar President Dr. F.L. McDonald issued a statement about the picketers, the searches, and the threats of violence. He said, "These high-handed actions have taken place within sight of police officers. Either we have a legally constituted government, or else the citizens are at the mercy of a small group seeking to establish themselves as the law."
That was the turning point. That was the time when individuals were called upon really to take a stand, either for or against.
Mayor Jimmy Kokonos called upon the police to uphold the law, and the pickets were cleared.
Most of the community, even though they might not have voiced it, were against the violence. I wouldn't exactly say that they were for the complete integration, but they were against the violence. So
there would be countless other battles here and across the country.
Even though I saw hate on the faces of some of the petitioners, but I also saw defeat, and I knew that what we knew as segregation and education was really over.
But what happened on those October nights in 1956 made the idea of a society based on equality seem a little less dangerous.
The effort to integrate Southeast Texas would take years, and you can't mention Theo Johns without mentioning Elmo Willard. Together, they fought legal battles in the 50s to integrate the city parks, the libraries, and Lamar University. And they would challenge segregation in the Beaumont schools in the early 60s and again in the early 80s. And Beaumont would elect Calvin Williams, its first black city councilman, in the early 70s. And Jefferson County would elect its first black commissioner when Ed Moore won his bid in 1987. And David Moore would become the city's first black mayor, and that wouldn't happen until this decade. We're now left with our #1 story of the century. But first, what about the stories that didn't make the list? There are some we struggled with that just seemed like they should be on the list, but there could only be 10. For example, the hurricane that hit southeast Texas in 1915. It devastated Port Arthur and resulted in the construction of the seawall. What about the story of Lamar University and the story of labor in southeast Texas? And there was a race riot in Beaumont in 1943 when white workers from the shipyard went on a rampage in a black area of town. Beaumont was under martial law for several days. And what about the musicians that came from southeast Texas? Harry James, the Big Bopper, the Winter Brothers, Janis Joplin, Mark Chestnut, Tracy Byrd, and Clay Walker. And some people suggested the story of KFDM should make the list. It was, after all, the experimental radio station that began at the Magnolia Refinery and the first television station on the air in southeast Texas. And it has always had the top-rated newscast, but it seemed a little self-serving to include it on the list, so we have our 10. What happened here on January 10th, 1901 changed southeast Texas, and you could argue the world, forever. When we ask area historians for their list of top stories of the century, every one of them put a single word at the top of their list: Spindletop. So we've reached our #1 story of the century for southeast Texas. The history of Beaumont and all of southeast Texas has been intertwined with the discovery of oil on Spindletop Hill for all of this century, and 2001 will mark its 100th anniversary. So we look at how southeast Texans are tracing the roots of Spindletop in preparation of its centennial year.
One of the key maps that we used was this map that was made of Spindletop in 1902 by L.J. Kopke.
Gerald Shine and his associate Nedra Foster have been searching.
And he made this map, and on it he shows not only the surveys or the subdivision, but he shows all of the wells. And he actually
Gerald Shine has been surveying Texas lands for 50 years.
Lawsuit that was back in 1932 that involved the tracks just to the east of this, and it also shows the Lucas Gusher in the same, basically in the same position.
He volunteered his expertise to lay to rest a question.
One of the Forrest Daniels books that we wound up with, he said on the very front of this thing, he said the location of the Lucas Gusher at Spindletop Field in Jefferson County.
Where exactly was the Lucas Gusher?
That he surveyed it.
At the turn of the century, an Austrian-born mining engineer, Captain Anthony Lucas, had taken up where others had failed, drilling on a knoll south of Beaumont known as Spindletop. January 10th, 1901, at 10:30 in the morning, something happened that had never been seen before in this country. From the ground came a fountain of oil, a gusher, and from it would rise the petroleum age. At the time, big wells produced 50 barrels a day. The Lucas Gusher poured out at 100,000 barrels a day. The find brought thousands of people and millions of dollars to southeast Texas, and speculation ran wild. By 1902, 285 wells lined the Spindletop field. The field would play out in a few years, but the technology, money, and the dreams sparked by Spindletop would spread to other Texas oil fields. The boom days would leave behind the backbone of the southeast Texas economy, the oil and petrochemical industry. And for the first time, the world would see oil as a cheap and plentiful fuel for ships, trains, and soon the automobile. Texaco, Gulf, Mobil, and Sun Oil all traced their roots directly back to Spindletop. Spindletop is still an active oil field, off limits to the public. But as the centennial anniversary approaches, an idea has come up to create a public place here. But the first step is to find the exact spot of the Lucas Gusher.
They say that the location
Surveyor
to
Daryl
the
Shine
east is,
believes he knows.
and it falls within 2 feet of where this location is shown on the early day L.J. Kopke map. So that just almost cemented the fact that that this is it.
The bearing we need to go is 153, and you see we're going 180. We can look at his mirror and tell that we're going.
He has plotted the coordinates on a global positioning satellite, and he has retraced the steps of all the known surveyors before him.
100 feet away.
And as it turns out, it was right where people have said it was all along. Back in 1941, 40 years after the Lucas Gusher, a monument was placed on the spot. The monument has been moved, but its foundation still rests on the Spindletop field.
That's true.
And when this surveyor says this is the spot, that's as good as it gets.
This is the place.
So right here, so many years ago, oil would gush from the earth and change the world.
If you're wondering where the oil field is located, just take Highland Avenue south out of Beaumont, cross under Cardinal Drive, and you run into a locked gate. Beyond that gate is a Spindletop oil field. It's private property, and if you go there, you're trespassing. But the group that's planning the Spindletop Centennial Celebration hopes to change that by creating a public access and a viewing area at the site of the Lucas Gusher. We'll keep you informed about those plans and all of the centennial events in the coming year. Well, thanks for taking the trip through the century with us. With everything that's happened in the 20th century, you wonder what the 21st century will hold in store for us. Well, someday the historians will tell those stories.